Today's last climb video is about a young couple's series of tirades against a young Sherpa they hired on Everest. You won't believe how frugal they were with other people's expertise, that they even overruled a guide who had the chance to save them. And the moment rescuers reached the couple, everything that Sherpa had warned them about was already written in ice. It was May 9th, 2016. That's when Floyd Chabert and Lyra Kaplan showed up at the agency office ready to negotiate their Everest permit like they were haggling over a used car. Floyd was 23, Lyra was 25, and the two of them had been together for 4 years. They were decent trekkers, I'll give them that much. They'd done some respectable hikes together, but neither of them had ever stood above 26,000 feet in their lives. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else on a mountain like Everest. The agency offered them 3 experienced Sherpa guides, men who had decades of combined summit experience between them. Floyd and Lyra looked at the price tag and refused. They said the fees included what they called unnecessary safety overhead. I need you to keep that phrase in mind because it ends up foreshadowing exactly how this disaster unfolds. Extra oxygen canisters, satellite phones, upgraded tents built to survive real storms, all of that got labeled as overhead like it was some kind of annoying add-on fee, instead of the stuff that keeps people alive above 25,000 feet. Usually, when I'm telling a mountain tragedy, there's a point where everything goes wrong. For this expedition, that point never really existed. The problems were visible from the very beginning, stacking up one after another until the ending felt less like a surprise and more like the final consequence of choices everyone had already watched them make. Instead of hiring one of those 3 seasoned guides, Floyd and Lyra requested a much younger Sherpa named Furba. He was 23 years old, the same age as Floyd, and he'd only worked 2 prior summit seasons. They got him at half the standard rate, and during the negotiation, Floyd told the agency staff that a Sherpa's job was basically just basic load carrying and pitching tents. Nothing more than that. They saw Furba as hired muscle, not as a guide, not as someone whose judgment should carry any weight on the mountain. And then came the part that really set the tone for everything that followed. They signed a waiver that explicitly declined the recommended emergency radio package. Think about that. They looked at a piece of paper that said, in plain language, that they were giving up access to better emergency communication equipment, and they signed it anyway, because it would save them a little money and a little wait. I always get irritated when I reach this part of the story, not because I know what happens next, but because this is where the resistance started. Nobody was asking Floyd and Lyra to cancel the expedition. Nobody was telling them they couldn't climb. People were just asking them to take a few extra precautions. Every suggestion was treated like an unnecessary expense or an overreaction, and that mindset never really changed. When the couple arrived at base camp, they wasted no time establishing the dynamic they wanted with Furba. During his safety briefings, they constantly cut him off mid-sentence. They reorganized the load distribution he had carefully planned, shifting more weight onto his pack, personal electronics, extra layers of clothing, items that had nothing to do with shared expedition gear, while trimming their own loads down to conserve their energy for the climb. Meanwhile, other Western climbers at base camp could hear them joking about what they called Sherpa babysitting. They referred to Furba, a grown man working one of the most physically demanding jobs on the planet, as the boy. This is one of those details that gets more frustrating the longer you think about it. Furba didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. Instead, he quietly recalculated his own oxygen flow rates to compensate for the extra weight he was now carrying because of their laziness. Think about the kind of restraint that takes. He was already doing the math on how to keep himself breathing properly under a heavier load that wasn't his idea, and he never said a word of protest that anyone recorded. That's not weakness. That's a guy trying to keep his job in an industry where Western clients hold all the leverage, and honestly, it says a lot about how lopsided that whole system can be. Before the first acclimatization rotation even began, the group gathered near the lower stretch of the Khumbu Icefall to practice basic safety skills, crossing aluminum ladders bridged over deep crevasses, transitioning between fixed ropes. This is standard practice for every expedition, no matter how experienced the climbers are, because the icefall is one of the most dangerous sections of the entire route. Furba walked them through the proper technique and told them clearly to clip both safety carabiners before stepping onto any ladder spanning a crevasse. Floyd unclipped one of his safety lines anyway, just to move a little faster, and he told Lyra to do the same thing. Lyra didn't. She kept both lines clipped and told him plainly she wasn't doing that. When Sherpa firmly told Floyd to reconnect his line, Floyd grabbed a spare sling and tossed it down near Sherpa's feet, telling him to carry it since, in his words, that's what they were paying him for.
This is the part I have to step back and just say it plainly. That's not how you treat anyone, let alone someone responsible for your literal survival.
You're on a glacier riddled with hidden cracks, deep enough to swallow a building. Several climbers from a New Zealand expedition team witnessed this entire exchange, and one of them later said that Sherpa looked less like a guide in charge of client safety and more like a subordinate being barked at by a boss who didn't respect him. That comparison stuck with me. It became the topic of conversation in the dining tent that night because everyone there understood something Floyd and Lyra apparently didn't ignoring. Icefall safety procedures doesn't just put you at risk. It puts everyone moving through that route at risk, because rescues in that terrain become exponentially harder when someone gets careless. That same night, during a packed dinner at base camp where expedition leaders from multiple teams were comparing notes on route conditions, things got even more uncomfortable. Sherpa sat down beside Floyd and Lyra to go over the next day's schedule, and Floyd quietly slid his maps and notebooks out of Sherpa's reach. Then he told him to go fetch more tea before they kept talking. Sherpa did it. He got up, walked off, and brought back the tea without complaint. While he was gone, Lyra started sketching out summit strategy with another climber at the table. When Sherpa returned, Lyra walked him through what they'd discussed, even if Floyd barely engaged uneven, but not a total blackout.
This is the point where my notes started filling up with question marks.
Most expedition teams treat their Sherpa guides as essential decision makers, because their knowledge of the mountain almost always exceeds what any foreign client brings to the table. A veteran American climber who witnessed the whole dinner exchange later said it was the first time in his career he'd seen someone deliberately exclude their own climbing partner from a conversation about the very mountain about to risk their lives on together. That's not just rude, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what a partnership on Everest is supposed to look like. After the team pushed up to Camp 1, things didn't get any better. Everyone started sorting gear for the next carry-up toward Camp 2, and Sherpa showed up visibly exhausted after hauling communal supplies through the icefall, arguably the most physically grueling and objectively dangerous section of the entire climb.
And what did Floyd and Lyra do the second he arrived? They handed him another bag.
Inside it were camera batteries, spare jackets, a tablet computer, and a stash of luxury snack food they didn't feel like carrying themselves. Sherpa told them straight up that the extra weight wasn't necessary and suggested leaving some of it back at base camp. Lyra agreed and pulled the snack food and tablet back out herself, telling Floyd they didn't need either above base camp. Floyd kept the camera batteries in though, and dropped the bag outside Sherpa's tent anyway, assuming the rest would get carried regardless. A European guide camped nearby watched part of this unfold and later described seeing Sherpa quietly repacking his own gear afterward, just to make room for the extra load. The guide said it struck him as unusual because most first-time Everest clients go out of their way to reduce their Sherpa's burden, not add to it with items that had little functional value above base camp.
Honestly, every time I revisit this part of the timeline, I find myself getting angrier on Sherpa's behalf, and I don't think that's an overreaction.
There's a difference between a client who's nervous and makes mistakes out of inexperience and a client who actively treats a professional climbing partner like hired help with no opinions worth hearing. Floyd and Lyra were squarely in the second category, and the mountain doesn't care how much money you saved on guide fees. It only cares whether you respected its conditions. As the team moved into the acclimatization phase, Sherpa proposed a fairly conservative plan: 3 nights at Camp 2 to let their bodies adjust to the thinning air, followed by 2 nights at Camp 3 before pushing higher. This kind of staged acclimatization is basically gospel in high-altitude mountaineering, because rushing it dramatically increases the risk of altitude sickness, which can escalate into life-threatening conditions within hours. Floyd pushed back almost immediately, citing their limited vacation time from work, and the team moved toward Camp 3 after just 1 night at Camp 2. Other climbers at Camp 2 remembered him going back and forth on it out loud for nearly an hour before deciding not deaf to the risk, just unwilling to let it cost him the trip. Lyra developed a mild headache not long after, a classic early symptom of altitude sickness, and Sherpa recommended they descend immediately to let her recover. They refused, with Floyd suggesting wrongly and unfairly that Sherpa might be overstating the danger to justify a slower pace. That night, Lyra started vomiting, another textbook sign of worsening altitude sickness. Sherpa gave her his own supply of Diamox, the medication used to help bodies adjust to elevation, and he stayed awake the entire night, monitoring her condition to make sure things didn't get worse.
And how did they repay that kind of care? They told him to stop hovering. Great.
His sacrifice of his own medication and his own sleep as some kind of overreaction or panic. The more I looked into this section, the less sense it made. I've read a lot of survival accounts over the years doing this show, and I've never seen a client base treat a guide's documented medical concern as some kind of annoying interruption. Diamox isn't cheap or easy to come by at 23,000 feet.
Giving up on your own supply for someone who's actually insulting your competence takes a level of professionalism I'm not sure I could manage in his position. In fact, I know I couldn't.
At Camp 2, the couple set up a lightweight 4-season tent they'd bought secondhand before the trip. Sherpa inspected it and noticed the floor fabric was thin, and the guy line anchors were just basic aluminum stakes rather than the ice screws recommended for that kind of terrain and exposure. They brushed off his concern, telling him they'd use this exact tent in Patagonia without any issues. Sherpa offered to lend them his own personal ice screws from his climbing kit. They turned him down, saying it would slow him down to dig through his gear for them. They also refused to even test the team's VHF radio, dismissing it as overkill for what they assumed was going to be a clear weather season. Every single one of these decisions reads like a small thing in isolation. A slightly thinner tent floor, a radio nobody bothered to test, stakes instead of screws. But mountains don't punish you for one bad decision. Most of the time they punish you for a long chain of small, bad decisions that all happen to align at the worst possible moment. And that's exactly what was being built here, piece by piece, refusal by refusal. When the group reached Camp 3, they received a satellite forecast update that should have changed everything. A deep, low-pressure system was tracking in roughly a day ahead of the original schedule, with wind gusts predicted to hit 50 miles per hour on the South Col. Sherpa translated the bulletin for them and pleaded for a rest day so they could properly reinforce their Camp 4 tent before attempting the summit push. Floyd checked his watch. Their planned departure from base camp was less than 2 days away, and he told Sherpa that forecasts like this one were always too pessimistic. He decided they would summit that night and be back down well before any storm arrived.
I don't think I need to explain why that decision is the hinge this entire tragedy swings on, but I'll say it anyway.
A trained Sherpa, someone who reads these mountains for a living, looked at a weather bulletin and asked for one single rest day to secure their shelter properly. And the response was basically, "My watch says we don't have time for that." When I think about how many disasters in mountaineering history trace back to exactly this kind of thinking, a deadline mattering more than a forecast, it's almost impossible not to feel a sense of dread building as the timeline moves forward from here. They left Camp 4 at 11 at night, but Sherpa was still busy melting snow for their summit water bottles because Floyd had earlier ordered him to repack their entire gear cache before departure. Floyd started shouting that they were losing their summit window, so Sherpa abandoned half the hydration supplies mid-task and rushed to secure the tent's entrance vestibule before they took off. In the rush, he left much of the tent's anchoring system unfinished. Several guy lines were left unsecured, and multiple planned deadman anchors, which are basically buried objects that hold a tent down in high winds, were never buried at all. The tent door itself was left unzipped. They reached the summit at dawn, completely exhausted from the rushed and poorly hydrated push.
Now, it's easy to read this part of the story and just blame Sherpa for the unfinished anchors, but that's not fair. And it's not accurate.
By a client screaming about a summit window that they themselves had created by refusing the rest day in the first place. This is the tragic irony at the heart of the whole disaster. The very thing they were so desperate to avoid wasting time on that killed them. During their descent from the summit, the wind shifted from blowing out of the south to blowing out of the west, bringing heavy blowing snow roughly an hour and a half earlier than the forecast models had predicted. Visibility dropped to about 10 feet in front of their faces. They stumbled their way back into Camp 4, but the tent was already flapping violently in the wind, with several of those unsecured guy lines whipping loose and slapping against the fabric. Sherpa immediately tried to resecure them using his ice axe, and Floyd actually went out to help hold the far corner steady while Lyra got the stove going. But between the wind and the missing anchors, it wasn't enough, and the tent never did get fully secured. This is where the story stops being about arrogance and starts becoming about pure physics and bad luck colliding with every earlier bad decision. A sustained gust ripped the tent loose from what little anchoring remained, collapsing the inner poles completely. The stove, a cheap, unsupported model that had no business being used at that altitude in those wind conditions, toppled over and shattered its fuel regulator. During the same collapse, the team's VHF radio got struck and its antenna bent badly enough that reliable communication was no longer possible. No fire, no way to melt more water, no way to call down to the lower camps for help. The tent fabric, now half torn away from its frame, offered them nothing more than scattered, wind-battered shelter against a storm that was only getting worse.
This is the point in the story where most listeners start feeling that sick, helpless dread.
You can now see exactly how every single refusal earlier in the expedition came back around to bite them at the worst possible moment. The radio, they refused to test. The ice screws, they refused to borrow. The rest day, they refused to take. All of it converged inside one collapsing tent on the South Col in the middle of a storm. Huddled inside the wreckage of their shredded nylon shelter, Floyd and Lyra turned on Sherpa. They accused him of deliberately staking the tent poorly to sabotage their climb, which is an accusation so divorced from reality it's almost hard to process. They demanded that he travel to a neighboring expedition's camp, believed to be roughly 100 yards east across the col, to borrow a satellite phone. Sherpa pointed out, correctly, that in zero visibility conditions like the ones they were experiencing, he could easily step right off the edge of the col and fall to his death. Floyd threatened to withhold his final payment and file a negative report with the guiding association that controlled his ability to work future seasons. Fearful of losing his entire livelihood, Sherpa strapped on his headlamp and crawled out into the storm. Floyd's reaction here is so unreasonable. The storm was already severe. Visibility was collapsing. Sherpa was refusing to make a solo crossing because he believed it was unsafe. Instead of arguing that the route was actually safe, Floyd reportedly threatened to damage his reputation and future employment if he didn't go.
Just think about the position that puts Sherpa in. He wasn't being asked to carry an extra load or work a longer day.
He was being pressured to take on a risk that he had already judged to be unreasonable under the conditions. Even with everything that was happening around them, the conversation somehow circled back to leverage, money, and employment.
What strikes me is how familiar the dynamic feels by this point in the story.
Earlier disagreements had followed the same basic pattern. Sherpa raised a concern, Floyd dismissed it, and the discussion became less about the mountain itself than about getting his way. The stakes were infinitely higher now, but the interaction wasn't really different. The weather had changed, the altitude had changed, the consequences had changed, the pattern hadn't. Sherpa navigated using his compass and his memory of the terrain, but the wind erased every track almost as fast as he made them. After roughly 40 minutes of crawling forward through the whiteout, he realized he'd drifted south toward the Lhotse face instead of toward the neighboring camp. He found a shallow windbreak formed by drifted snow and ice and sheltered there, periodically forcing himself to move his hands and feet to keep blood circulating and stave off frostbite. Several hours later, the storm briefly cleared just enough for him to spot the orange dome of a Swiss team's tent at Camp 4. They pulled him inside, and he was alive, though severely frostbitten on 2 of his fingers. The Swiss team didn't have a spare radio either. Their own had been damaged earlier in the storm, but they agreed to descend together with him as soon as there was enough light to move safely. Back in the ruined remains of their own tent, Floyd and Lyra tried to melt snow by holding it directly in their gloved hands, but the cold pulled heat away from their bodies far faster than they could generate it. Their water bottles had frozen completely solid. Lyra's fingers went numb. Floyd tried sparking the stove back to life with a lighter, but the gas line had been severed in the collapse, and there was nothing left to ignite. Based on the evidence later reconstructed by investigators, since there were no surviving witnesses to their final moments, it seems probable that they argued about whose fault the situation was. Floyd apparently blaming Lyra for not holding the tent pole steady enough, and Lyra blaming him for rushing their departure from Camp 4 in the first place, so on and so forth. And as hypothermia set deeper into their bodies, they stopped shivering, a dangerous late-stage sign, and became increasingly lethargic, drifting in and out of consciousness wrapped inside what remained of their torn nylon shelter. Despite everything I've said, there's still something almost unbearably sad about picturing their final hours playing out exactly the way they'd treated everyone around them for the entire expedition. arguing, blaming, refusing to take responsibility for the choices that put them in that position to begin with.
I don't say that to mock them in their final moments. I say it because it's a pattern that defines the whole tragedy right up until the very end.
Made their way down to Camp 2 the next morning and reported the couple's worsening situation. A rescue party reached Camp 4 by noon the following day, once the storm had finally passed. They found Floyd and Lyra dead, their bodies curled around the crushed remains of the stove, both severely dehydrated and frozen solid. The tent was a complete wreck, but rescuers noted something specific. While sorting through the gear pile, the ice screws that could have held the tent down properly were conspicuously absent. Sherpa was questioned almost immediately by authorities and became the subject of a preliminary investigation at base camp, and the couple's grieving families publicly claimed that the Sherpa had abandoned his clients to die alone on the mountain.
I remember reading that initial accusation when I first started researching this case and feeling a flash of real anger.
It's so crazy that it represented the exact same dynamic that had defined this entire expedition from day one. Blaming Sherpa first, asking questions never. Here was a man who had given up his own medication, repacked his own gear to absorb their unnecessary luggage, crawled through a whiteout at the threat of losing his career, and the immediate public reaction was to assume he was the villain of the story. Additionally, the couple's families pursued a lawsuit against the guiding agency, seeking accountability for what happened to Floyd and Lyra, but they ultimately lost the case once the signed waiver and the recorded dismissals of safety advice were formally entered into evidence. However, the investigation found that emergency frequencies had never been programmed into the team's radio, confirming their poor communication setup. Multiple witnesses independently recalled Floyd dismissing safety advice by calling Sherpas just babysitters. Engineers also determined the tent had been improperly anchored, with critical anchors and guy lines left unsecured, while Sherpa's unused ice screws remained packed away after the couple refused his recommendation to use them. In the end, Sherpa was cleared of all charges, but he lost 2 fingertips to frostbite that he'll carry as a permanent reminder of this expedition for the rest of his life. He went back to his village with a tarnished reputation among some foreign operators who'd heard only the initial accusations and never bothered to follow the case through to its actual conclusion, which is its own kind of quiet injustice layered on top of everything else he survived.